This is Daybreak. Good morning. Thank you for staying with us. And if you are joining us, the hashtag on Twitter is Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya and at Ayub Abdikadir, the hashtag on Twitter, that is. And looking at the front pages of the publications, the Standard says more promises as Kenya turns 60. President William Ruto yesterday urged the country to back his reform plan, saying the future can only be safeguarded through the measures he's putting in place, like the housing fund and job creation. The highlights included the affordable housing program, which he said will help in addressing unemployment crisis in the country and towards the owning of a home, or the ownership, which he said is the advantage part of it. In terms of the prioritization by the government of the processing and value addition of agriculture products, this is being achieved through, he says, the establishment of the county industrial parks in the country. Government has stepped up, according to the president, the establishment of 5 additional export zones in the next financial year in Sagana, in Thika, in Njoro, in Eldoret, and in Busia. Border riders will be able to ride electric motorcycles by September this year to cope with rise in international petroleum prices. The government has said the president is committed to delivering universal healthcare coverage that enables every Kenyan attain dignified healthcare at a minimal cost. The National Open University, according to the head of state, will obtain its charter this month, and courses are being uploaded for commissioning. The Daily Nation says, "This is my promise to you," according to President William Ruto, who also warned government officials against engaging in corruption. On transport, he said there is a plan to roll out electric vehicle public transport system, the introduction of electric motorcycles for border operators, the plan by his government of reforming the National Hospital Insurance Fund, NHIF, deliver universal healthcare coverage, the employment of community health promoters across the country. On education, the redesigning of the competence-based curriculum ongoing, according to him, and plans to launch the National Open University. It is during yesterday's event, the head of state also launched the second phase of the fund that will offer loans of between 20,000 to 1 million Kenya shillings to registered groups. He made his plan yesterday clear and outlined his achievements in 8 months in office, even as he made more pledges to transform the economy and shape his legacy. The head of state also defended the controversial housing levy, saying it will deliver jobs to thousands of youth, and admitted the high cost of living was keeping him awake at night. That story is further highlighted on pages number 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 and 7 of the publication. Javas Bigambo is governance and political commentator. Good morning, Javas. Thanks for making time for the broadcast. At the center is Gabriel Muduma, who was in Embu yesterday. Gabriel,
how are you doing?
Thank you. And he interestingly called for a cup of uji, but I wasn't around. Wish you had caught up with Stephen Leto.
I tell you, you need to be taking this uji. I think it's now it's actually becoming a national craze.
And Governor Mbarire, hand on heart, talked about it.
Of course, of course. Uji is actually becoming an in thing.
And Dr. Brian Mutier is an advocate of the High Court and commentator on political and governance issues in the country. Gentlemen, a lot happened yesterday, and seemed that it was more or less a replica of what transpired in 1963, and that was the 3 thematic areas that were outlined by then Prime Minister, the inaugural time, Mzee Jomo Kenyatta, who talked about ignorance, the place of education, poverty, healthcare, that is, and disease, in a meticulous plan to have Kenyans witness the benefits of freedom in post-independent Kenya. I begin with you, Gabriel. Taking stock of where we came from, where we are, the definite observation is that the consistent element is that the Kenyan people have been playing their part. The gap and the vacuum ends on the part of those who have been in power in the previous administration and the current one, with the president saying that this is my promise to you, the Kenyan people. What needs to be done from policy perspective to address some of the glaring inconsistencies in terms of governance since independence?
Thanks, Ayub, and good morning to our viewers. I think there's something you mentioned, and probably many Kenyans don't realize this, that the turn of independence are the core 3 things that we were fighting for. Being ignorance, being eradication of poverty, and primarily also eradication of disease, happens to be still some of the items that we are grappling with 60 years later. And you can't say that we've not attempted to handle some of those things, because honestly, I think we have. The spirit of a nation has reason when called upon to do so. And I think we've really put in so much resources. We've had very great policies that have actually been attributed to some of these things. But many Kenyans will tell you Some like us who we know for sure, we've tried to read the history and the mood of the people at the same time. We can all say that we are not where we need to be. But one thing I can promise you, Ayub, we are not where we used to be. Now, there's something that I've always heard when we are talking about these national holidays, and Madaraka Day in particular. So many people try to compare Kenya with this one country, and I don't know why, and that is Singapore. And many people will tell you, Javas, that in the 1965, when we were getting independence, Singapore was there.
Yeah.
Now, if you look at what Singapore did, is what is currently happening. The first thing that they did was make hard decisions, as we are seeing today. Show me a leader who never made hard decisions, Ayub, and I'll show you a leader who never succeeded. So when you make hard decisions, it means the integrity and the intent must be in the right place. I look at what the president has been talking about housing. Many people have run to chastise that particular program, not understanding what it will do. They actually give you examples of a nation like Singapore, but they fight the principles and the policies that made that country great. That is the con of man. You can give us very good examples, but you are not ready to tell us what attributes, what policies, what hard decisions did they do or did they make to make that country great? And if you look at it, they started with some of the policies that are being made today. The Central Provident Fund, because I've read so much about it, in Singapore, was used to show or to tell the country how to save. Not only that, because it was used to develop infrastructure, including housing. The Central Provident Fund, many will tell you who have studied it, had a huge degree of mandatory savings. Because you realize you got to a point where Singapore was doing way worse than what we are talking about, than where we are today. But they were able to come out of that shackle of dependency to debt and help from out their neighboring countries and the outside world, that they realized that was not a way to develop and have a self-sustaining economy. And so the hard decisions that were made, I find or can mirror them to where we are today. It starts with the integrity of intent and making the hard decisions.
Thank you. And we'll talk about the thematic areas of the president's speech, Javas and Dr. Bigambo, Dr. Mutia and Javas, because he outlined a mature democracy. He talked about the elections last year in August, where he said Kenyans have shelved ethnic politics and voted based on issues that were campaigned upon by the presidential candidates. But Dr. Mutia, Madaraka Day itself, so in 1963 and in 2023, 60 years later, is the achievement, or are the achievements over time, or the lack of it thereof, commensurate with the mood music in the country?
Thank you, Abdi. I think, first of all, we have to appreciate where we are coming from. And I want to say that in the last 20 years when Kibaki took over from President Moi, I think is when the country witnessed this accelerated economic growth. In the sense that the 24 years that we were under the grip of the Nyayoism, or what we call Kanu era, to me that was like we were in the wilderness, economically speaking, because the kind of transformation that we achieved was quite slow, painful, and painstakingly very slow as a country. But when Kibaki took over, we saw that emergency, that accelerated speed in terms of economic recovery, and we could see things that we could only see on, other countries and other Western media, or, channels. And therefore, for me, we can only take stock from the presidency of Kibaki coming this way, is when we can say now we can see that kind of momentum of growth in this country, and we are seeing things working for us. As much as we would want to say that, the country is not heading in the right direction, depending on where you are seated, to me as a person, I see a lot of hope, I see a lot of change, and I see a lot of optimism from Kenyans, because the kind of infrastructure that we have been able to witness witnessed of yesteryears, since Kibaki, President Uhuru, and also the current administration. Yeah. The kind of sector reforms that we are seeing today at policy level, the kind of infrastructure in terms of healthcare, in terms of education reforms, to me, those are things that I'm taking a lot of pride compared to yesteryears. Because when you look at the governance aspect during Moi's time, to me, it was deplorable. We could only compare ourselves with countries like Uganda, Somalia, Sudan, and so on and so on. But right now, we are talking about a country which is heading in the right direction. Actually, we are benchmarking ourselves with Morocco. We are benchmarking ourselves with South Africa, Nigeria, and we are actually being ranked as one of the most promising economies among the 30-something countries in Africa, and also globally. Kenya has been touted as one of the most promising. And to me, as a person where I'm seated, Abdi, and my colleagues here, things can only get better because we have laid the infrastructure as a country, and we are witnessing leaders who have come up, including our current president, who are very visionary, and they are walking the talk. Because when you look at how they are engineering the whole economic aspect of this country, to me, I think this is the right moment for us to take a self-reflection and say that this country is already on the move.
Javas, I'm looking at the 1963 speech by then Prime Minister Jomo Kenyatta, and he outlined the issues that were to do with poverty, disease, and ignorance, which largely will be rooted out by education, poverty, which is more or less pegged on empowerment economically, and also disease, which then is informed by lack of healthcare. But still, the head of state yesterday talked about reform in the NHIF, which is largely healthcare. We talked about reforms or redesigning of the competence-based curriculum, which more or less, again, can be tied to ignorance because there seems to be a problem with the current education system that we have, the ongoing curriculum. And the third itemized issue by then President was on poverty, which largely will be weeded out by employment and economic opportunities for the Kenyan people. 60 years later, we're still talking about the same issues, but in a different language. What do you think might have led to the very vacuum that is evident 60 years later?
Ayub, I sit here this morning as a drum major for optimism. And as long as the codes of memory will stretch, we will appreciate the hard fact that the past 6 decades have been decades of growth and dynamism in our development approaches. Yes, ignorance, poverty, and disease, that is the triangle of death. And what I appreciate as I sit here, wearing the garments of optimism, I would say that the kind of ignorance, the kind of disease, the kind of poverty that was experienced and was being experienced by this country and was being spoken to by President Jomo Kenyatta is far different from the kind of poverty that we're dealing with today. There were very few vehicles on the roads in Kenya. There were far fewer hospitals in the country today. Nairobi alone today, Nairobi County, manages about 119 public health facilities alone, public health facilities, which is far different from what was existing in 1963. The kind of education institutions that we have in Kenya today have scaled up exponentially compared to the kind of educational institutions, whether universities, whether high schools, whether primary schools, and even at the time we didn't even have early childhood education given priority by government the way it is being done today. And so I want to encourage myself that these 70 years that we're celebrating of Madaraka are 70 years of a people that have pulled themselves up by always coming up with a new laundry list of governance and development priorities. And I think looking at it from that perspective, you would see that the kind of shift in terms of development and governance priorities that President Jomo Kenyatta had, and those that President Moi had, and those that President Kibaki had, and now, and even those that President Uhuru Kenyatta had, and now what President William Ruto has, you would see a growing trajectory. I did not hear President Kenyatta Jomo talk about SMEs and enterprise. Today, we are looking at all these things. Now, another thing is that we as a people need not beat ourselves in the chest so much because of the kind of plight and circumstances we find ourselves in today, because we are, I think, far better. Because when you look at, in terms of even matters to do with, at the household level, socioeconomic priorities and interests, the focus today is elevated compared to how it was even during the Moi era. The kind of attention that the populace gives to governance, accountability, equity, social justice, these things were not a priority during the Moi time. They were not a priority during the Jomo Kenyatta time, but they were critically a priority during the Kibaki time and Uhuru Kenyatta time, and now during William Ruto time. And so I think I can say that the fabric of our democracy and governance is becoming even stronger.
Okay.
And that should be much more encouraging. When you look at our democracy, the first component that His Excellency the President spoke to yesterday, you'd realize that while our democracy is still young, moving towards maturity, I would say that we are one of the most leading and exciting democratic examples on the continent compared to any other. And in fact, many countries look up to us. Many wonder actually if we are even an African country when it comes to election management. Even though, factually speaking, challenges still abound in our election management processes. Our democracy is growing. Today, Ayub, in far too many countries on the African continent and even around the world, people are dying, losing lives, just to secure the right to democracy, the democratic spaces to be expanded, and the freedom of speech, the two of which are in abundance or in high supply here in Kenya. On the African continent, there are fewer countries where people will speak and criticize government, engage government, and in fact, demand that they are placed on the table squarely to discuss matters to do with, for example, finance bill, to discuss matters to do with legislative processes, bills in parliament, at whether it's local level or even at the national level. I think we have come so far, even though we are going far still, but I think we are in a fair place.
Oh, all right, and taking stock of that very itemized thematic area, number one is which you talked about, we'll be discussing that at length because he talked about ethnic balkanization being a threat to our democracy. He said that Kenyans rather shelved or sidelined, he rather scrap-hipped the ethnic politics in the August elections last year, and talking about the need for democracy and the risking of their lives by many people. The very evident example is the 2011 Arab Spring in Tunisia, which spread to Libya and then to Egypt, still active in parts of Syria. It went into Lebanon, and which saw the overthrow of long-term rulers in the parts of Africa and the Arab world. Gabriel, then talking about the other reforms that the president touted yesterday was what's needed in the healthcare reform, which is very key for as a driver of the country's progress. Kenya is an exporter of human resource.
Correct.
And that's very evident, and that their input is felt across the continent and the world. But then how does the government justify then when you want to roll out universal healthcare coverage and more than 50% of the public service in the country are insured by private firms, for example, instead of NHIF?
Well, that has always been a serious thorn in the flesh. And if there's one thing I know for sure, that the current administration has burnt the midnight oil doing, is to ensure that the nation is healthy. Now, Ayub, you know there's something we can't run away from, and that is how healthcare and our education are tied in. Because as you saw some time back, we saw countries from Europe, let me call them, the Western countries, looking actually inward in Kenya to try and find health workers during COVID. You saw they came recruiting, and that got me thinking, why? It is because, albeit the fact that we think there's so much that we need to do in our education sector, which is true that we must, there's also something that suffices, that we have what other nations are looking for in terms of education. Yes, we are trying to re-engineer this education, but we know it is also a backbone in which most of our health sector is actually paved. And so here we are looking at how we ensure an entire nation, for our workforce, for our labor to be realized, not only must we be healthy, but we also must ensure that institutions that are offering that particular health are able to provide the services that when you go with your NHIF card, you're able to be treated. I saw last week, I was reading somewhere where many people are complaining that now they cannot use their NHIF card. Now, let me tell you something. These issues do not happen with this administration. Anytime you find there's an element of degradation, whether you look at it economically or otherwise, it actually shows you that there has been a serious and sometimes deliberate, so to speak, effort where you degrade such an environment. And it can happen in so many ways. But key among them is that there are policies that are not being followed. A, or B, there is corruption within that particular entity. Okay. And so you end up in an environment that is not really geared toward ensuring that the common mwananchi is able to get a service, given that they have been contributing sacrificially to a cause. And so it sometimes pushes us back to a very unfortunate situation where a Kenyan is able to go to a health facility and they cannot get the service that they need.
Yeah, yet they paid for it.
Yet they paid for it. And these are now the hard questions that I told you about. This is a situation that a leader must subject himself to a deliberate attempt to emphasize that such situations and such environment must work as they are supposed to. Key in my submission, you saw what happened at Kemsa.
Yeah.
We were here, all of us. If you look at that situation a few years back, Kemsa was mentioned in serious problems, but we didn't hear any heads rolling. Really, it was left as it was. Okay. People who are close to that administration were mentioned, but nothing happened. This time round, when an entire procurement process was bungled, we saw people leave, including very senior
government officials.
Okay. So, to me, that is what I would like to see. If there is an issue in a particular department in government, I like the very fact that the president has said he takes personal responsibility. Okay. Music to my ears. So if this is the issue, we're talking about NHIF, where Kenyans who have been contributing sacrificially are able to go to a health facility and they cannot get the service that they require. Okay. Heads must roll, Ayub.
Okay, Dr. Mutie, the head of state yesterday also warned government officials against engagement in corruption. Yeah. His tone since the interview we had with him at State House has been clear that, look, I am responsible in the safeguarding of the Kenyan people's hard-earned money. I mean, that sounds goodwill from the head of state. He has no prosecutorial powers, yes, because they are mandated institutions in government. But what trickle-down effect will that have for government officials to stay away from public resources, aside from what they have to earn, which is their salary at the end of the month?
Absolutely, absolutely, and I do love that because during the electioneering period, I think the other wing of the political divide used the president as a person, as one of the symbols of corruption in this country. And they were doubting that this man will even talk the walk when it comes to matters of fighting graft in this country. And now that he has been spearheading this agenda of actually ensuring that corruption is, non-existent in public service or even private sector, this is some indication that the man is in charge. And by also sounding the warning drums to, the bureaucratic processes in this country that they should be ridden free of corruption, to me, I think it's a hallmark of someone who is actually trying to stamp his authority and the proof the naysayers wrong that he was really not keen to be the person to be actually tasked with the mandate of curbing graft in this country. And I'm saying this because when you look at the yesteryears, Uhuru's administration, of course, when they said that the country was losing 2 billion per day through corruption and other, shenanigans. To me, I think that was a good lesson, a good stepping point for the current administration to see how they can tighten those loose ends and ensure that kind of narrative does not exist within us, the current administration, which to me is trying to prove that graft is a thing of the past. And I want to laud the president for, first of all, firing the first bullets when it comes to stamping his authority when it comes to matters of fighting corruption by parading, or by ensuring that the environment is at policy level and at institutional level is strong enough to warrant, parading of corrupt or suspects for that matter, because they are still guilty, innocent until proven guilty, where, parading them in a court of law and ensuring that, the message is out there that we are not going to entertain any sort of corruption-related, issues. And that's why KEMSA officials and those from KEBS, you remember the sugar issue, were paraded, recently. And to me, that's a warning drum. And I think is also trying to ensure that we live within our means. Because when you look at the amount of money that has been lost through graft in this country, it is enough to enable us actually set 2 or 3 infrastructural, high-intensive capital infrastructural, projects for this country. By living within our means, it means that we seal all the loopholes that are existing when it comes to graft. And to me, this is a sector issue that needs to be addressed holistically. When it comes to agriculture, we need to address the issues of those, what do you call them, those musketeers who collude with government officials to import food, fertilizers at exorbitant prices at the chagrin of the economic distress of this country. We also need to address the issues of education, where we have witnessed, officials also, misusing funds meant for free education. We have seen, all the cases of corruption at the health care. We have seen these issues of graft cutting across all the sectors. And this is the high time that the president is using a new broom to sweep his house clean. And that's why he has a new administration, men and women who are willing to walk the talk and to ensure that the president succeeds. To me, where I'm seated, I think the president started very well, because when you look at the caliber of his administration, most of them are, people who have never been, engaged in matters of corruption, apart from maybe some few cases which are criminal in nature, and a few who have also been eating the headlines in the wrong way, that they have been given opportunity to serve when they are dirty. So to me, I think going forward, Hayub, I think the president must also provide, that kind of support and ensure that he gives us as a country that reassurance once in a while that the country is heading in the right direction as far as his fight against voice corruption. I mean, corruption is concerned. Okay.
Javas, were we to arrest corruption at the very embryonic stage where we set out our priorities after 1963, would the image of the country be different today, more than the optimism that you have expressed?
Well, the issue is the calibration of corruption. Because the kind of graft that bedeviled this country in the first regime is very different from the kind of graft bedeviling this country during the fourth regime. Now we are in the fifth. Now, one thing is that throughout the campaign, President William Ruto did not campaign on the platform of fighting graft, yet he is. And those who campaigned on the platform of fighting graft, for example, in 2002 election, leading to it, we had former President Mwai Kibaki campaigning on the platform of zero tolerance to corruption. Shortly after getting into office, just a few months, we had the Anglo-Leasing scandal and many other scandals. I think while I appreciate the bravado and bravura with which President William Ruto is engaging in fighting graft, he must actually fight it properly, including opening the closet and going for his regime, his administration, demonstrably. Those who have been culpable of being the suction tube of public finances or resources, even in the last regime, and so. Because if we don't do that, we would seem to be encouraging corruption, organized corruption, budgeted corruption, because does it not disturb us and shame our conscience that even, for example, during the KEMSA scandal that my brother Gabriel has spoken to, we had persons that were indicted and mentioned adversely beating their chests and pointing their fingers at Kenyans, calling them out, telling them that, you know what, nothing can happen, and they prefer so-and-so to be a particular presidential candidate. I mean, are we this shameless that you've been adversely mentioned, and yet you're looking at Kenyans in the eye and then telling them, I prefer so-and-so to be a particular candidate? Former president, for example, spoke to the issue of giving a 21-day ultimatum to investigate matters of KEMSA graft. I know that according to his calendar, 21 days have not lapsed yet. And no Kenyan has reason to ask these questions. The problem is not even just the successive administration in this country. The problem, Ayub, is us. We are so afraid to ask difficult questions of those in power. Tell me, how many Luos have asked Raila difficult questions about accountability even in ODM or when he was prime minister? How many Kikuyus have asked difficult questions to Uhuru Kenyatta when he was president? Very few. We are afraid because, first of all, we are so much intimidated by tribal capitalism that is driving the political space. Because we are yoked by tribal capitalism since independence. Now, for instance, during the first administration, President Jomo Kenyatta told a nation, optimistic as it was, go back to your farms. But did they have the implements to do proper farming? From that time, people were fighting for land. Today, land is still a problem. We have had commission after commission from Ndungu to many others.
Yeah.
Land is still a problem. Food security is still a challenge. When you look at it, you realize that the issue of lack of proper responsibility in industrial practices in China and continental Europe is causing adverse climate change challenges in Africa. And it's encouraging, for instance, that, the present regime under President William Ruto is looking at issues to do with, say, climate change interventions and affordable housing and enterprise as the triangle of progress. As I sit here, Ayub, I hear the whispers of Adam Smith, who still speaks to us through his central thesis, that when it comes to the wealth of a nation, government must encourage enterprise, innovation, and regulated self-interest, the pursuit of which helps even the development of a society. Today, we must have a government that is encouraging innovation, enterprise. I like the issue of SMEs that has been outlined even in the present administration and yesterday's president's speech, talking about even the issue of the Hustler Fund Phase 2. I want to imagine, and progressively so, that we are going to see, of course the impact may be known perhaps in 2 years or a year and a half, about the critical impact of these programs that have been rolled out by the government. And so I think the issue for me from the first administration through the present in these 70 years of Madaraka that we're celebrating is not just about proposals by governments.
All right.
The issue is about the implementation of those proposals in a way that is accountable, transparent, and in a way that involves the people, and the people themselves are willing to checklist the government. And that should be the basis upon which even people are re-elected into office.
Okay. And which he talked about yesterday at length, and that is where he said the place of the Kenyan people in a constitutional dispensation where their opinion outweighs that of any other. And talking about public participation, the finance bill, which he said has elicited reactions, positive and negative, and all the Kenyans who appeared before the Finance and National Planning Committee of the National Assembly. This is Daybreak on Citizen Television. The hashtag on Twitter is Daybreak. The SMS code is 22422 at Citizen TV Kenya. At Ayub Abdikadir, and towards the tail end of this broadcast, we'll sample your feedback here on the broadcast. And when we get back from the break, we'll be taking a look at the president's first thematic area, talking about the country's maturing democracy, a threat he said that ethnic politicization poses to this very democracy, and what needs to be done going forward in terms of understanding and the freedom which he said Kenyans have gained from entangling themselves from ethnic politicization of the country's progress in August 2022. We'll talk about that in the context of the general elections and what needs to be done to fix one of the pertinent problems that often mushrooms after every electoral cycle, which is how the elections are held here in the country. Stay tuned.